The deputy called her FBI badge fake. Then her duress signal lit up the task force. The muzzle hovered 8 inches from her temple, close enough that she could smell the gun oil over the dust kicked up by passing freight trucks. Special Agent Camille Adjei kept both hands flat against the window frame of her gray sedan, fingers spread, exactly where Deputy Cole Hastings could see them. Her voice stayed level. "My credentials are in my jacket pocket, left side. I'm going to move slowly to reach them." Hastings didn't answer. He kept the Glock trained on her, trigger finger, resting along the frame rather than inside the guard, which was the only mercy in the whole encounter. She had been driving for 6 hours straight, coming off a wiretap briefing 2 counties over, tracking a synthetic opioid pipeline that had been bleeding through these back highways for the better part of a year. She was tired in the specific way that made calm feel like the only tool left. Somewhere under the passenger seat, a small device waited, untouched, ready to do something Hastings had no idea existed. It wasn't standard field equipment. It had been issued specifically to agents working the wiretap operation. Given the isolated roads, the assignment required them to travel alone. 12 minutes earlier, Route 62 outside Vintner Flats had been empty in both directions. The kind of empty that made an isolated stop feel private even in broad daylight. Hastings' cruiser had come up fast behind her, lights already flashing, and she had signaled, slowed, and pulled onto the gravel shoulder without hesitation. Her Camry's lane position system had logged no drift in the previous 40 minutes, and her cruise control had been locked at the posted limit since the county line. None of that mattered yet, because none of it had been asked for. Hastings approached with his hand already resting on his holster, and before she could roll her window all the way down, he told her she'd been swerving toward the center line. She hadn't, and the data sitting quietly in her vehicle's own systems would eventually prove it. But in that moment she simply said she understood his concern and asked what he needed from her. He didn't answer the question. He asked where she was coming from. She said she'd rather explain that once he'd seen her identification and handed over a valid civilian driver's license through the gap in the window, he studied it too long, the way people study something they've already decided not to believe. Then he ordered her out of the vehicle. She asked, calmly, what specific violation gave him grounds to escalate a routine stop into an order like that. That question was the one that made him reach for his weapon. "Get out now. Hands where I can see them." She complied immediately, stepping onto the gravel with her hands raised, palms open, moving at a pace that left no room for misinterpretation. "I'm a federal agent," she said, "FBI. My credentials are in my left jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for them slowly." Hastings' eyes narrowed, but he didn't lower the gun. "Do it slow," he said, "and don't test me." She reached across her own body with 2 fingers, extracted a slim leather case, and held it open at arm's length, the gold shield catching the flat desert light, her photograph beside it, the bureau's seal pressed into the leather, a credential number printed below a strip that shifted color faintly when the case tilted. Hastings glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. "Anybody can buy one of these online," he said. "That's not real." "You can verify it," she said. "There's a duty line. Dispatch can confirm it in under a minute." He didn't call it in. He told her the badge looked too clean, that she didn't look federal, that there was no marked vehicle, no vest, no backup, just a tired woman in a rental car on an empty highway, telling him what he was supposed to believe. A younger deputy, barely 2 years off probation, stood a few feet back near the cruiser's open door. Deputy Sam Ridley had seen agent credentials once before, during a joint training exercise, and something about the holographic strip and the credential formatting matched what he remembered. He didn't say anything yet. He just stood there, hand hovering near nothing in particular, caught between what his training told him and what his senior partner was doing. Hastings told her to turn around, and when she asked him, one more time, to call it in first, he closed the distance and put the cuffs on anyway, tight enough that she felt the metal bite before he'd finished ratcheting them. "Impersonating a federal officer," he said. "Obstruction. You can explain the rest downtown." She didn't resist. She let her weight settle forward against the warm hood of her own car, cheek near the metal, and while Hastings patted her down for a weapon she didn't reach for, she pressed her knee twice against the inside panel of the driver's door, in a pattern that looked like nothing at all. Under the passenger seat, A small duress transmitter woke up. It sent 4 pieces of information at once: her agent identification number, her exact coordinates, a flag confirming she was actively speaking under duress, and a request for verification against the active task force roster she'd been assigned to that week. 40 miles away, inside a temporary field office set up for the wiretap operation, a duty officer watched an amber light shift to red on a console that rarely lit up at all. He pulled her file in under 30 seconds, confirmed her assignment, confirmed the vehicle registration matched the one logged for her that morning, and picked up a radio instead of a phone. "We have a duress signal on Adjei, Route 62, Wren County. Nearest units respond." As it happened, the nearest units were already close, because a surveillance team from the same operation had been parked less than 2 miles down the same highway, watching a stretch of road that intelligence suggested the opioid network used for transport on a loose but recognizable schedule. 2 unmarked SUVs peeled off that position within 90 seconds, and a state trooper already patrolling the interstate spur turned back toward Vintner Flats at the same radio call. None of them knew yet whether this was a misunderstanding or something worse. They only knew a federal agent had signaled distress after being stopped by a local officer who had never called it in. Back on the shoulder, Hastings was still explaining himself to Ridley, building a version of events that placed her furtive movement and his fear for his safety at the center of it. When the first SUV crested the rise behind them, Ridley stepped back from the cruiser without being told to. The lead agent out of the SUV, a broad-shouldered supervisor named Marcus Whitlow, who'd worked 2 prior cases alongside Adjei, didn't ask about the badge first. "Is she hurt?" he said. "Is she still restrained? Has anyone touched her vehicle?" Someone answered that she was cuffed but uninjured, and Whitlow told the state trooper to keep Hastings and Ridley separated before either of them compared stories. He crouched beside Adjei, checked her wrists where the cuffs had bitten, and had them removed himself rather than waiting for Hastings to do it. When she reached for her own credential case afterward, her fingers didn't close around it cleanly on the first try, and she had to steady her wrist for a second before she could hold it. Only once she'd confirmed she could feel her hands properly again did he turn to the deputies and explain, evenly, that Special Agent Adjei's credentials were valid, her assignment was active, and the stop itself had no documented basis in dispatch or department records. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The body cams on both officers had captured the entire sequence, and body cam footage doesn't require anyone's permission to be believed. Within a day, an evidence response team had assembled 6 separate sources describing the same 12 minutes. Adjei's Camry showed no lane deviation and steady cruise control engagement for the better part of an hour before the stop. Hastings' own dashcam captured him approaching with his hand already on his holster, before any words had been exchanged. His body cam recorded him refusing to request dispatch verification, even after she offered the duty line twice. Ridley's body cam, reviewed separately, captured him leaning slightly to examine the shifting security strip on her credentials. And later, in a recorded interview, he admitted he'd recognized the formatting from a training session and said nothing because Hastings outranked him, and he didn't want to be the deputy who contradicted a senior partner over a badge. The dispatch log showed no verification request had ever been made, despite Hastings' later written report claiming he'd tried and failed to confirm her identity. That report, once compared against the timestamps, didn't survive contact with the record. The false statements piled up quickly once investigators laid them side by side. He wrote that she had swerved toward the center line. Her own vehicle's lane position data showed no drift at all. He wrote that she made a furtive movement toward her waistband. Her hands had stayed visible the entire time, confirmed by 3 separate camera angles. He wrote that her credentials appeared counterfeit and unverifiable. The dispatch log showed he'd never attempted verification. And a federal duty line technician confirmed the credential number had been active and assigned to her for the past 6 years. Each claim in his report failed against a different piece of evidence, and none of the evidence depended on anyone simply taking her word over his. The investigation didn't stop at the roadside. A financial review of Hastings' accounts turned up cash deposits that didn't match his salary. Arriving on a schedule that loosely lined up with known transport windows, the opioid task force had already been. tracking along that same corridor. A subpoenaed phone record showed contact between Hastings' personal cell and a burner number linked to a courier already under surveillance. Short calls placed just before certain vehicles passed through his patrol zone unbothered. Investigators were careful not to overstate what they had. The calls and deposits suggested an arrangement, not yet a confession. Nothing in the records suggested Hastings had known who Camille was investigating or that he'd stopped her because of it. The stop had grown out of the same habitual bias that shaped his other complaints, and the financial trail was something the case only found afterward, running underneath it. What seemed clear was that Hastings' aggressive habits on that highway weren't limited to one bad afternoon. A contractor named Malcolm Boyce had filed a complaint 8 months earlier, describing a similar stop on the same stretch of road, an accusation of concealed narcotics with nothing to support it, and a report that closed within a week without anyone interviewing him. When investigators reopened his file, Boyce said he'd stopped driving that highway after dark for a while, and that he hadn't expected anyone to ever look at his complaint again. A watch commander, who had signed off on closing that earlier case, was placed on administrative reassignment pending a review of every complaint he'd approved for closure, and a second supervisor, less clearly complicit but repeatedly negligent about Hastings' stop numbers, was ordered to review his own oversight practices. Deputy Ridley cooperated fully once the investigation opened, turning over his own notes from the encounter and acknowledging on the record that he'd frozen when the gun came out instead of raising an objection he now believed he should have raised. That admission didn't erase his responsibility, and his department opened a separate review of his conduct alongside Hastings, though prosecutors weighed his early, voluntary cooperation differently than Hastings' continued denials. Hastings was indicted on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault with a firearm, false imprisonment, and official misconduct, with a separate count tied to the falsified incident report, once investigators confirmed its specific claims conflicted with recorded evidence. The bribery and protection of criminal activity counts moved on a slower track, pending the outcome of the larger opioid case his financial records had become part of. He was placed on administrative leave, surrendered his weapon and badge, and was scheduled for a certification review hearing separate from the criminal proceedings. He rejected an early plea offer, choosing to fight the charges at trial, even as the body cam footage, the dispatch log, and his own written report worked against each other in ways his defense struggled to reconcile. Out of the case came a set of changes the county board and the state's oversight board both adopted before the year was out. Any officer who rejects verified federal or state credentials during a stop now triggers an automatic external review, independent of that officer's own chain of command. Dispatch centers run an automatic verification check the moment any credential is presented, rather than waiting for an officer to request one. Bodycams lock the moment a firearm is drawn during a stop, preventing later edits or convenient corruption claims. Vehicle telemetry from any disputed stop is preserved immediately, rather than left to routine data cycling schedules. Junior officers now have a protected channel to document objections separately from a senior partner's report, and officers no longer patrol the same isolated corridor indefinitely. 3 months after the reforms took effect, a different deputy on a different isolated road doubted a traveling nurse's hospital identification after she explained she was carrying medication samples to a rural clinic and her vehicle didn't match the facility's registered fleet. But this time dispatch ran the automatic verification within the first minute, before the stop could escalate any further, and the encounter ended in less time than it took to read her ID out loud. Malcolm Boyce's reopened complaint was formally sustained that same season, and the correction was added to his record along with a letter he later said he hadn't expected to receive. Special Agent Adjei read about that stop in a routine briefing memo, unattached to her own case, and felt something settle that had nothing to do with her own file. The wiretap investigation continued in the weeks that followed, and 2 of the transport windows the task force had been watching finally made sense once Hastings' call records were laid against them, giving investigators the confirmation they needed to move on 3 more arrests along the same corridor. Adjei returned to the task force office once the roadside matter had been handed to prosecutors, set her scratched credential case on her desk, instead of back in her jacket, and turned her attention to the surveillance logs still waiting to be reviewed. Weeks later, she drove Route 62 again on an ordinary assignment, alone, without an escort trailing behind her. She passed the stretch of gravel shoulder where it had happened, checked her mirrors out of habit rather than fear, and kept driving toward the next briefing on her schedule. The badge had never been what gave her the right to expect fair treatment on that highway. It had only made it possible, once someone finally looked, to prove exactly how quickly that right had been denied. This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes.